You know how they say that death has a way of revealing secrets? Well, I never believed that until I found myself standing in my grandfather's dusty attic 3 days after his funeral, surrounded by decades of accumulated memories and the suffocating smell of mothballs. I wasn't supposed to be there alone. Mom had specifically said we'd clean out Grandpa's house together as a family, but grief makes you do strange things. I couldn't sleep that night. Couldn't stop thinking about how empty the house felt without his gentle humming drifting from the kitchen or the soft click of his reading glasses being folded and placed on the side table. So I drove over at dawn with my spare key, telling myself I'd just grab a few of his books to remember him by. That's when I saw it, tucked behind his old navy trunk, partially hidden by a moth-eaten blanket, a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox but heavier, with intricate carvings along the edges that I'd never seen before. The wood was dark with age, and when I lifted it, something shifted inside with a soft rustling sound like dried leaves or paper. My hands trembled as I carried it downstairs to the kitchen table where Grandpa and I had shared countless cups of coffee and stories about his younger days. Or so I thought I knew his stories. The brass latch was tarnished but opened easily, as if it had been used recently. Inside, nestled in faded blue tissue paper, were letters. Dozens of them tied with a ribbon that had once been red, but was now the color of dried roses. I picked up the first letter with the careful reverence you'd use to handle a butterfly's wing. The envelope was addressed in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, but the name made my breath catch. Elena Rosetti. I'd never heard that name spoken in our house, not once in my 32 years of knowing Walter Mackenzie as the devoted husband to my grandmother Margaret, father of my mother and two uncles, pillar of our small community. The return address was our house, Grandpa's house, but the date stamp was from 1952, 3 years before he married Grandma. I know I should have stopped there, should have respected his privacy, even in death, but curiosity is a powerful thing. And the letter was already half open from age and handling. I could see fragments of words through the yellowed paper. My darling, can't stop thinking, wish things were different. My grandfather, who I'd known as a quiet man who spoke in measured sentences and showed affection through small acts of service, had written love letters, passionate ones from the glimpse I could see. I sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, holding that letter and trying to reconcile this discovery with everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me after my father died when I was 10. Grandpa Walter, who read me bedtime stories, who taught me to fish with patience that seemed endless, who never spoke about other women or a life before Grandma Margaret.
When I finally opened the letter, my grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from the pages, but it was a voice I'd never heard before, young, desperate, alive with a passion that made my chest ache. My dearest Elena, it's been 2 weeks since I've seen you, and every day feels like a month. I keep replaying our last conversation by the lake, the way the moonlight caught in your hair when you laughed at my terrible joke about the fish. You said you'd wait for me, but I'm scared, Elena. Scared that what my family expects of me and what my heart wants are two different paths that can never meet. I set the letter down with shaking hands. This wasn't the grandfather I knew. This was a young man torn between duty and love, writing to someone who had clearly meant the world to him. But who was Elena Rosetti, and why had I never heard her name? I opened another letter dated 6 months later. Elena, my love, the engagement announcement will be in Sunday's paper. I need you to hear this from me first, not from town gossip. Margaret is a good woman, and our families have been planning this union since we were children. But you must know that my heart belongs to you, will always belong to you. My stomach dropped. Grandpa had been engaged to someone else while writing love letters to Elena? This wasn't the man who had told me that true love was about loyalty, about sticking with someone through thick and thin. This was someone who sounded desperate, conflicted, maybe even deceptive. I rifled through more letters, searching for answers but finding only more questions. There were responses from Elena, too, written in a flowing script that spoke of secret meetings, stolen moments, and a love that both of them seemed to know was doomed. My darling Walter, you speak of duty and family expectations as if they're chains around your wrists. But what about the duty you owe to your own heart? What about the promises you made to me under the old oak tree? I understand the pressure you're under, but I can't help but wonder if you're choosing the easier path. Elena hadn't made this easy for him. She'd challenged him, pushed him to choose her over his family's expectations. And from what I could piece together from the dates and contents, she'd lost.
The final letter from Grandpa was dated just a week before his wedding to Grandma Margaret. My beloved Elena, by the time you read this, it will be too late to change anything. I've made my choice, and I pray that someday you'll understand that I made it out of love, not just for you, but for everyone I care about. My mother's health is failing, and this marriage will secure both our family's futures. I can't be selfish with so many people depending on me. But know this, there will never be a day that I don't think of you, don't wonder what our life together might have been. You are the great love of my life, Elena, and that will never change, even if I can never see you again. I was crying by then, tears dropping onto the old paper and threatening to blur the ink that had somehow survived decades. This was a tragedy worthy of Shakespeare. Two people who loved each other deeply but were kept apart by circumstances and expectations that seemed impossibly heavy when viewed through modern eyes. But I still didn't know who Elena was or what had happened to her. The letters from her stopped after Grandpa's wedding, but there were a few more from him, written sporadically over the years. Birthday wishes sent to an address I didn't recognize, updates about his life, my grandmother's pregnancies, his job at the factory, small-town news, written with the careful tone of someone trying to maintain a connection while respecting boundaries. The last letter he'd written to Elena was dated just 5 years ago. Dear Elena, Margaret passed last month, as I know you heard through mutual friends. The cancer was swift, and I'm grateful she didn't suffer long. I find myself thinking of you more often now, wondering if you're well, if you found happiness with someone who could give you everything I couldn't. I know I have no right to reach out after all these years, but I needed you to know that loving you was the best and worst thing that ever happened to me. Best because it showed me what it meant to feel truly alive. Worst because it taught me the weight of choosing duty over desire. I hope you can forgive an old man his memories. With all my love, Walter. This letter was different from the others. It had never been sent. There was no postmark, no address on the envelope. It was simply marked Elena in Grandpa's increasingly shaky handwriting. He'd written it, but couldn't bring himself to mail it, probably knowing that opening old wounds after 60 years would serve no purpose except to satisfy his own need for closure. I sat back in the kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the weight of this secret my grandfather had carried alone for his entire married life. He'd loved my grandmother. I was sure of that from watching them together. But it had been a different kind of love. Comfortable, respectful, built on shared experiences and mutual care rather than the passionate fire I'd glimpsed in his letters to Elena. Had Grandma Margaret known? I thought about her sometimes sad smiles, the way she'd watch Grandpa when he didn't know she was looking, the gentle distance that had always existed between them despite their 45 years of marriage. Maybe she had suspected, or maybe she'd simply accepted that her husband's heart had room for memories that didn't include her. I spent the rest of that morning reading through every letter, every small note and pressed flower that Elena had sent in return. By the time I finished, I felt like I knew her quick wit, her artistic nature. She was a painter, apparently. Her fierce independence that had made her unwilling to settle for being someone's secret. She'd never married, according to the last few letters. She'd devoted herself to her art and to teaching children.
building a life that was full and meaningful, even without the great love she'd lost. But where was she now? The address on the most recent correspondence was from a small coastal town, about 3 hours north of us. Elena Rosetti would be in her 80s now, if she was still alive. I knew I should tell Mom about the letters, should share this discovery with the family, but something held me back. Maybe it was the protective instinct that comes from witnessing someone's most private moments. Or maybe it was the fear that knowing about Elena would somehow diminish my family's memories of Grandpa Walter. He'd been our rock, our moral compass. What would it mean to learn that he'd built his life on a sacrifice that had left him forever changed? Instead, I found myself driving north that afternoon, following the directions to the address from Elena's last letter. I told myself I was just curious, just wanted to see if she was still alive and well. But deep down, I knew I was looking for something more. Maybe closure for a story that had been left unfinished. Or maybe just the chance to tell Elena that Walter's love for her had never faded. The town was smaller than I expected, one of those coastal communities where everyone knows everyone, and strangers are noticed immediately. I stopped at a local coffee shop and asked the barista, a woman about my age with kind eyes, if she knew Elena Rosetti. "Oh, Miss Elena," she said with a warm smile. "Everyone knows Miss Elena. She taught half the kids in this town before she retired. Lives in the blue house at the end of Maple Street, the one with all the gardens. But you should know, she's been in the hospital the past 2 weeks. Pneumonia." My heart sank. After all these years, had I missed her by a matter of days? How's she doing?
Better now, thank goodness. She's supposed to come home tomorrow or the day after. Stubborn old bird refused to stay any longer than absolutely necessary. The barista studied my face with curiosity. Are you family? She doesn't get many visitors from out of town. Not exactly, I said, suddenly unsure how to explain my presence. I have something that belongs to her, something from a long time ago. I spent the night in a small bed and breakfast, the letters in their wooden box sitting on the nightstand like a secret waiting to be revealed. I barely slept, wondering what I would say to Elena, whether she'd even want to be reminded of a love affair that had ended in heartbreak 60 years ago. The next afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a charming blue cottage surrounded by the most beautiful gardens I'd ever seen. Every inch of the yard was planned with an artist's eye. Roses climbing a white trellis, herbs arranged in perfect spirals, flowering bushes that created natural borders between different sections. This was clearly the home of someone who understood beauty, who could take ordinary things and arrange them into something magical. I knocked on the front door, the wooden box under my arm feeling heavier with each passing second. When the door opened, I found myself looking at a woman in her mid-80s with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing paint-stained clothes and holding a cup of tea. Her eyes were the clearest blue I'd ever seen, and when she looked at me, I had the strangest feeling that she already knew why I was there. "You're Walter's granddaughter," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded, too surprised to speak. How could she possibly know? "You have his eyes," she continued, stepping aside to let me in. "The same way of looking at the world like you're trying to solve a puzzle. I wondered if one of you would find the letters someday." Her living room was filled with paintings, landscapes, portraits, still lifes that captured light in ways that made them seem almost alive. But what struck me most was the portrait hanging above the fireplace, a young man in his 20s with familiar features, laughing as he tried to hold a large fish while standing beside a lake. My grandfather, as I'd never seen him before, carefree, happy, deeply in love. "He was beautiful, wasn't he?" Elena said, following my gaze. "I painted that summer we met, when he was still young enough to believe that love could conquer anything." We sat together on her sofa, the box between us, and Elena told me their story. How they'd met at a church social when she was visiting relatives in town, how they'd fallen in love with the intensity that only comes once in a lifetime, how Walter's family had already arranged his engagement to my grandmother, the daughter of the family that owned the bank where Walter hoped to work. It wasn't just about money. Elena explained, her voice still carrying traces of an old hurt. Walter's mother was sick, and the medical bills were enormous. His father had lost his job, and they were facing the loss of their farm. Marrying Margaret would solve all of those problems. Her family would give Walter a good job, pay for his mother's care, keep his family from losing everything they'd worked for. "But you loved each other," I said, the unfairness of it making my chest tight. "We did, desperately. But Walter was the kind of man who couldn't be happy if his choices hurt other people. He carried the weight of his entire family's future on his shoulders, and I couldn't ask him to abandon them for me." Elena smiled sadly, though God knows I wanted to. "Did you ever see him again, after he married Grandma?" "Once," she said softly. "About 10 years after his wedding, I came back to town for a funeral. We ran into each other at the grocery store. He introduced me to Margaret as an old friend, but she knew. Women always know. She was gracious about it, but I could see in her eyes that she understood exactly who I was." "How did that feel?" Elena was quiet for a long time, staring at the portrait above the fireplace. "Like my heart was being torn in half all over again. He looked good, happy enough, settled. He was carrying your mother on his shoulders, and she was laughing at something he'd said. I could see that he'd built a good life, but I could also see that part of him would always wonder, what if?" She turned to look at me then, and I was surprised to see that her eyes were dry. Whatever tears she had for the story had been shed decades ago. "I never regretted loving him," she said firmly, "and I never regretted not fighting harder for him either. Walter made the choice that let him sleep at night, and I respect that. Not everyone is brave enough to choose love over security, and not everyone should. He was a good man who did right by his family, and that matters more than most people understand." I opened the wooden box and showed her the letters. Elena laughed when she saw them, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "He kept them all," she marveled, picking up one of her own letters and reading it with the fond smile of someone revisiting an old photograph. "I kept his too, you know. They're upstairs in my desk drawer." "He wrote you letters even after he was married," I told her, showing her the birthday cards and updates he'd sent over the years. "And this one, he wrote it after my grandmother died, but he never sent it."
Elena read Grandpa's final letter with tears in her eyes, and when she finished, she pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. "He was still my Walter until the end," she whispered. "Still thoughtful, still carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." We spent the rest of the afternoon looking through the letters together, Elena filling in details and context that brought their love story to life in ways that mere words on paper couldn't convey. She showed me photographs she'd kept, pictures of Walter that I'd never seen, taken during their brief time together. In every one, he looked younger than I'd ever imagined him, laughing with an openness that I realized I'd never seen in all my years of knowing him. "Do you think he was happy?" I asked as the afternoon light began to fade. "With Grandma? With the life he chose?" Elena considered this carefully, the same way I'd seen Grandpa consider difficult questions. "I think he was content. Walter was the kind of man who found happiness in doing his duty well, in being needed and useful. He loved your grandmother in his way, a steady, reliable love that was different from what we had, but no less real. And he adored his children and grandchildren, you especially." "Me?" "Oh, yes. The few times we wrote over the years, he always mentioned you. How proud he was of your curiosity, your kindness. He said you reminded him of someone he used to know." She smiled at me. "I think he meant me." As I prepared to leave that evening, Elena walked me to my car, moving slowly but with the grace of someone who had learned to find peace with her choices. "What will you do with the letters?" she asked. I'd been wondering the same thing. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should tell my family about them, about you, but part of me thinks some secrets are meant to stay secret. There's wisdom in both choices. But remember this, your grandfather's love for me doesn't diminish what he felt for the rest of you. If anything, it shows how much capacity he had for love, how deeply he felt everything. That's not something to be ashamed of. She handed me an envelope. She said, "This is for you. I wrote it after you called yesterday, after I realized that Walter's family might finally know about me."
I opened it in my car after driving a few miles, pulling over to read by the dome light. Dear one, your grandfather was the love of my life, but more than that, he was the best person I ever knew. He chose duty over desire, not because he was a coward, but because he was brave enough to sacrifice his own happiness for the people he was responsible for. That kind of selflessness is rare in any generation. I want you to know that I never resented him for choosing his family over me. I was proud of him for it. And I want you to know that learning about all of you, his children and grandchildren, through his occasional letters, was one of my greatest joys. Through you, I got to love Walter in a different way, to see the man he became because of the choice he made. Don't let this knowledge make you love him less. Let it help you understand that good people sometimes face impossible choices, and the best we can do is choose with love and live with the consequences as gracefully as possible. With affection for the granddaughter of the man I loved, Elena. I drove home that night with my head spinning and my heart full. The wooden box sat on my passenger seat, no longer a mystery, but somehow even more precious now that I knew the whole story. Over the following weeks, I found myself seeing my grandfather differently, not as a different person, but as a more complete one. I understood now why he'd sometimes looked wistful when old love songs played on the radio, why he'd been so adamant about teaching me to follow my heart while also being responsible to the people who depended on me. He'd lived that tension his entire life. I never told my mother or my uncles about Elena or the letters. Some stories I decided belonged to the people who lived them. But I did start visiting Elena regularly, driving north once a month to sit in her garden and listen to her stories about art, about teaching, about the full life she'd built in the space left by the love she'd lost. 6 months after our first meeting, Elena passed away peacefully in her sleep. She left me her portrait of young Walter, along with the note asking me to remember that love comes in many forms, and all of them matter. I keep the wooden box in my own house now, along with Elena's painting. Sometimes, when I'm facing a difficult decision, I think about my grandfather standing at his crossroads, young, in love, and forced to choose between his heart's desire and his family's needs. I think about the grace with which both he and Elena accepted the consequences of that choice, how they found ways to honor their love without letting it destroy the lives they'd built afterward.
It occurs to me that maybe this is what real love looks like. Not just the passionate fire of youth, but the wisdom to know when sacrifice serves something larger than yourself. My grandfather loved Alina enough to let her go, and she loved him enough to let him. And in the end, they both found ways to be happy, different kinds of happiness than they'd originally planned, but happiness nonetheless. The wooden box sits on my bookshelf now, a reminder that the people we love are often more complex, more heroic, and more human than we ever imagined. And sometimes the most profound love stories are the ones that end not with happily ever after, but with I chose well and I lived with love. Just last week, I received a letter in my mailbox with no return address, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a simple note. Your grandfather's story touched my heart. We all have boxes of letters we've never shared. Thank you for reminding me that love takes many forms and all of them matter. I don't know who sent it, and I suppose I never will, but it sits in the wooden box now alongside Walter and Elena's letters, proof that some stories have the power to ripple out into the world long after the people who lived them are gone. And maybe that's the real legacy my grandfather left behind. Not just the love he shared, but the understanding that choosing with love, even when it hurts, is always the right choice in the end.